Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Today, I'm here with Matt Hankey, the CEO of New Energy Equity, and we are going to talk about all things solar development and everything in between. So I want to take the opportunity to let Matt introduce himself, and we'll jump right into the discussion today.
Thanks for having me on. Excited to talk today and spend a little bit of time together. As you said, my name is Matt Hankey. I'm the CEO of New Energy Equity. We are a distributed generation and community solar developer based in Annapolis, Maryland. We have about 100 employees across the country, based in 4 different offices: Annapolis, Maryland, upstate New York, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Boulder, Colorado. And recently, as of April of last year, we had some very exciting news that we joined Elite. The publicly traded company out of Duluth, Minnesota, acquired our company in April of last year. And we couldn't be more thrilled about the acquisition and the transition associated with it. It's been a great process for us and great for the future of the company. So excited to be here today, excited to talk to you, and hopefully shed a little bit of light on the mystery that is distributed generation and community solar.
Yeah, so, when we think about what's happening in the industry, distributed generation is kind of the tipping point that's really made us hyper-focused on having and enabling full situational awareness to the edge of the grid. And, for our listeners, we've over time built a grid that is pretty much becoming the largest machines in the world. And so the way it was designed was the energy source came from the bulk generation, centralized, and the electrons moved one-way power flow. And so when we want to start connecting that generation, the energy source, to the edge, we start to have a whole different ball game, and we really have to approach it collaboratively. And that's what we're here on this podcast to discuss about. And so I just wanted to throw over, what do you, from your experience and what you've been doing, growing the company and developing these new energy resources, as the opportunities and then really the challenges that you see as we transition into this clean new energy future?
Sure, absolutely. So by way of background, I joined the solar industry about 15 years ago. Prior to that, I was a finance nerd who wanted to make a difference in my life. So I started a renewable energy company, not dreaming that we would find the success that we found. The industry has grown massively and run through a number of challenges. Since I've been in the industry and before, every year you kind of look back on what has happened the previous year, and you say to yourself, how are we going to grow by that much? Plus another sometimes 20, 50, 60, 100%. And with that growth comes a number of challenges that we've seen come up that have impacted projects along the way. To give you context, when I started in the industry, if we were talking about potentially developing a project today, we could potentially look at having the project done by the end of the year for a number of reasons. Interconnection studies were anywhere between 30 and 60 days. The grid was not near as full in terms of capacity and applications that were going into the interconnection queue. Permitting was a bit faster. Materials were readily available, all of those things. Now, to give you context, the projects that we're developing, we're talking about currently installing in late 2025. That's a pretty big range. Wow. And back when I started in the industry, it was going to be a challenge to get the project in 5 to 6 months, but it was certainly something that was potentially possible. And now we're looking at 18 to 24-month timelines to look at projects and see how we can get them from start to completion. So there's a number of challenges that we've seen. Interconnection is by far the biggest issue for our industry right now. It's being talked about by a number of agencies, industry groups. FERC has taken up the policy. The DOE has issued statements and white papers on interconnection. And then you have a number of trade groups, both on the developer side, which is the side that we're on, as well as the utility side, who are trying to find the best way to make these things happen, and it's not easy. So I looked up a few numbers before the podcast, so I'll spout those off here real fast. So in 2010, this was eye-opening to me. The interconnection queue was at 50% of the installed capacity throughout the United States, and right now it is over 50% of this installed capacity. So it's grown tremendously, almost by 3 times. And solar applications were 80% of the applications over the last year for interconnection capacity, in the United States. So it's a huge issue. And there's a number of utilities and trade groups who are trying to take a proactive approach to this. We at New Energy Equity firmly believe that to the extent that utilities and developers are on different sides of the playing field and not working together, it's going to be a challenge for both. And so we do try and take a proactive approach that is collaborative with the utilities in each market to see what we can do, because ultimately, whether it be following the federal policy and federal goals of clean energy targets by a certain time, or the utilities' self-stated goals of renewable targets by a certain time, we all need to work together in order to find a solution to this big issue in order to see those goals met. And without that collaboration of the utilities and developers, who aren't always on the same page, of course, it's going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to take the opportunity. So, my perspective and where I've come from is, I started my career, quite honestly, as a power system engineer consultant. So I did a lot of generation interconnection studies for the utility and the grid perspective. So a large part of that work was gathering the data, having the models, and running the studies, and then providing that information to enable or state what type of grid enhancements would be required. Most of that work was on the transmission, and it wasn't until I entered the utility space where I started working with the industry and realizing the lack thereof models for the distribution system to really study and understand the impacts that distributed energy resources on the distribution grid have an impact. So what ultimately you've seen over the last 10 years in all the development is going from, you're trying to connect, I assume, at the transmission and the distribution side. Each one in its own. One's regulated by the federal government. The other's regulated by each individual state that the utilities assets sit in. And so that creates very complicated layers of decision-making and really processes to ensure that whatever's connected to the grid can still maintain reliability, safety, and security. And so with that comes a lot of challenges. And really, I think, and this is kind of, my passion behind really being the host of this podcast, is driving the awareness that as an industry, we all have a part in enabling the data to be available, the models to be built, and the analytics to be really ran, and then that intuitive knowledge to be provided across all stakeholders. And so we're actually like almost in a race, across all of our territories to have that certain maturity level, depending on which utility or which grid that you're connecting with. So I bet we could talk all day about how each individual state has its own challenges and opportunities, and then really trying to connect to the bulk transmission grid has its even more complicated issues. And that was mostly the cue you were speaking of, is when you're trying to connect anything greater than, like, let's say 5 megawatts, depending on where you are, it will trigger a whole other set of like regulatory and like stakeholder processes versus the individual residential, smaller scaled solar. So I guess just for the listeners, like, your projects are predominantly all sizes, or what like variation of sizes are your projects that you just spoke of?
Yeah, so the majority of what we do is community solar. It's probably 90% of our business right now, and our average system size is creeping up much closer to 5 megawatts AC. Is where we're typically at, and yes, the facts that I cited were based on larger transmission interconnection, but I also think it's reflective of the growth in the distribution sector as well. And when it comes down to it, you have a bunch of solar that's trying to be interconnected, and then you have some conflicts along the way, right? Utilities want to protect infrastructure and their systems. States want to push towards their clean renewable energy goals. You have other conflicts where utilities by design have to move a little bit slower because they need approvals, they need to work within the state and within the constructs. And you have developers who are notorious for being able to move very, very quickly, right? And so there's a lot of conflicts in that process. And I agree with you that working collaboratively is absolutely necessary. And I think it shows itself on both sides, right? The utilities need to do that. The developers also need to do that. And that's something that we've tried to do, as an organization in each state market that we go into. And you are seeing that be successful in our size projects in certain cases. So you have states like Minnesota and New York where they are starting to study projects in groups where they can share interconnection upgrades across those projects versus one project bearing the burden of all of the interconnection cost upgrades in order to get to a certain system size, and then the projects behind them have a much lower interconnection cost in order to go in. And hopefully developers and utilities can take a long-term view of interconnection applications instead of looking at how one project plugs into the grid, right? And I think that that's the mindset that we need to shift on both sides. Is we need to have a longer term view on how this works and how those interconnection costs can be potentially shared, across whatever's coming onto the grid in order to hit those goals in the long term.
No worries. So yeah, I could not agree more with everything you said. It's going to be a collaborative and very, and I think the power of the communication that we're having now, and really all the communication that we can have, is educating all of the various stakeholders and really empowering those that have the data to really run these studies really holistically different, with a different perspective. And that will require time because we're like in the process of, changing, and everyone, as we know, does not like change. So until the technology and the capabilities are vetted, it really, there is that delay. But as you probably realize, we don't have the time. I mean, there's an opportunity here to really transform our energy sources. And we've seen that through and through over the last really 20 years as, solar has become more viable. And then the other opportunity that's, been quickly following is really energy storage. A lot of conversations and capabilities are, if you map or create or match solar with energy storage, could help solve these problems. So, what is your perspective of how you believe energy storage could play in, providing solutions to these associated challenges that we just spoke of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say about 5 years ago, I think I sat down with the management team here at New Energy Equity, and I think we said that, hey, by next year, energy storage should probably be 20% of our business. And remember, we're working in distributed generation. It's community solar and distributed generation, but we're working on some smaller scale, non-utility scale things. And that 20% has continued to push every single year. And I think we've seen a lot of growth. You hear all the headlines about all the energy storage going in. The majority of that energy storage is going in at utility scale, because I think it's because that utility scale storage is able to take advantage of higher cost electricity with day ahead markets and things like that within the larger transmission systems. I'm still not seeing that significant growth on the distributed generation side, and I think it's because there's not a ton of incentives able to bridge the benefits that energy storage brings. Because I agree with you, I think it could be a solvent for a lot of the problems. Because when you study from an interconnection standpoint, when you study projects, most of the issues are on the outlier scenarios, right? Which could be damaging to infrastructure, unsafe conditions, maxed out conditions, things like that. And so energy storage is a great solution to solve a lot of those. But in order to get energy storage prevalent in distributed generation, it does need to be incentivized, right? It's not something that a developer like us is going to put on a project if it drags down the return of the project. Because ultimately, everybody in the food chain needs to make money along the way. And so I think we're starting to see a little bit of momentum New York is a good example of providing some level of incentive for distributed generation storage. California, in their recent community solar program, which they're rolling out right now, is providing a requirement but also benefit for energy storage to be installed. And so I think that it's worked financially within the utility scale projects because of the ability to take advantage of very high cost energy periods to shoot the electricity out onto the grid when it's most economical to do so. I do think that we need to look at how we can incent storage at the distributed level, because I don't think there's any argument between utilities and developers that there's a significant financial benefit of doing so, both from an electricity cost standpoint, but also probably from a savings of infrastructure costs in terms of replacements and upgrades and things like that. And so I think that that's what needs to happen in order to, I'll update you right now. Storage is not 20% of our business. And 5 years ago, we thought it would be. Right now, I don't think it will be next year because of some of the reasons that I'm outlining. So I think we're on our way there. It's just been a little bit slower than I expected. The other thing that I'll note is I do think that utilities and developers, for the benefit of the customer, need to get on the same page as to how that storage will be treated over the long term. Because one of the things that we're concerned about, we take reputation integrity, very, very seriously. And one of the things we're concerned about is promising a customer to see some type of savings or an investor to see some type of revenues from storage. And then the utility changes their rate structure in order to remove some of those benefits of demand response or the other benefits that storage provides. And so that's our concern is we don't want to get 3-4 years down the road. We've installed a ton of storage on behalf of customers, and then the rates change for them, putting them in a different financial position than they expected to. And so I think that it would benefit all parties, utilities and developers, to sit down and talk about what that looks like. And like you said, I think the challenge is these are complex discussions that have a lot of inputs and a lot of variables on both sides. While we try and get along with the utility side of the business and collaborate, not all developers do. And so, there is some rub there as well. And so, from that standpoint, it's how do you have that conversation fast enough to take advantage of some of the opportunities that legislation like IRA has provided for both utilities and developers and customers for that matter, in terms of reducing their cost of electricity long term. How do you have those conversations quickly and collaboratively in order to not miss out on the opportunity? But I think storage is another case where, like interconnection, bringing a lot of folks together and trying to figure it out, maybe in a new way with some old influences, instead of using old ways on both sides, would be tremendously beneficial.
Yes. I think, being on the grid side and really understanding, what the business model is for utility, also the regulatory model greatly impacts. It's not that the technology, the innovation, and the capabilities of all of these new energy sources, it's not what's stopping, I think, us moving forward rapidly. It really does come down to, creating the correct conversations with the right players so that the decisions can be made and really, as you said, incentivized. Because from a grid owner perspective, having a significant amount of solar, it would be really beneficial to have the energy storage so that you can, tap into the intermittency and really reduce the overall detriment that intermittency could play on the overall power quality and, the flow of the electrons in general. But it is really difficult to have those conversations quickly, and then to ensure both sides understand the lack of data or the lack of models or the lack of understanding of what would be required, because every grid is a fingerprint, and every circuit within a grid is even a fingerprint and unique in itself. So there's no peanut butter spread. There's no one fit solution across all. And I think that causes a lot of animosity, if not anxiety, over these types of projects. And so I think, it really does take conversations like this and really education across all tables to really drive a lot of your projects and really where we need to head in this world of distributed energy resources. And I just couldn't agree with you more. So I know we're kind of wrapping up on time, and I just, from your perspective, you kind of iterated and said a few things like, but what would be some of your key lessons learned that really you have seen positive outcomes that like enabled those quick conversations and forward progress to happen relative to maybe some where it wasn't so easy? Like, do you have any key takeaways that we can share with our audience?
Yeah, I think where we've been successful in markets from an interconnection standpoint, which does tend to be the biggest challenge, is truly when both sides, developer and utility, come together and collaborate, but they're also truthful with what that means to their business, right? I think there's listen, everybody needs to have a financial return on their investment, both from utility and the developer side. But there's a lot of good with solar installations and storage installations that can benefit, like I said, the utility, the developer, and ultimately the consumer of electricity. And so getting together, having those conversations with decision makers. So not having the conversation for the sake of having a conversation, but having the conversation for the sake of finding a solution to the issue on both sides is where we've seen the most success come. I mean, listen, I think that we're at a point now where arguably interconnection has hit a breaking point, right? Both on utility scale and distributed generation. Arguably, we're not out of the woods yet. We're certainly not out of the woods yet. But I do think there's a lot of attention being shined on the problem, and I think with that, there's a lot of smart folks on both sides who can find a solution if they come together. They're truthful with what it means, with each other, and they collaborate to find a solution. And I think if we could pull that off, I think 2 to 3 years from now, we'll be in a much better place from an interconnection standpoint. And if I can tell you anything from 15 years in the industry, I will tell you that something else will have popped up at that point in time, which will be the issue. So certainly it's it's never a dull moment as a developer. But I do think this is a solvable one. And I think that coming together too, Elizabeth, and talking about your point of, hey, having storage here would be greatly beneficial to the grid, right? There's a chance to say, all right, well, let's incentivize that to happen, right? Let's put an incentive on that because it is beneficial for both parties for that to happen. And I think those types of conversations are great ones to have in order to find the solution to what is a really, really big problem that everybody's working hard to try to solve.
So in the end, we need to educate and we need to bring the right people together and keep moving forward. So I couldn't agree more, as I said a couple times, and I really appreciate your perspective and all the work that you're doing to really help transform our grid together. So with that, Matt, I just want to say thank you for your time, and I look forward to collaborating with you in the future.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the opportunity. Enjoyed chatting with you and look forward to talking again soon.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.